The Berlin Airlift, a chapter in history written in 1949. Operation Vittles, as the military called it, was first viewed as an overnight emergency mission. In 1989, the unprecedented operation is viewed as an event which changed the course of history. Tens of thousands were called on to keep their fellow human beings alive. 40 years later, those who made the airlift a success returned to Berlin as heroes. This is the story of their sacrifice and their return to receive the thanks of those whose lives and freedom they've saved. Hello, I'm Mike Victor, and I'm proud to bring you the story of the return to Berlin. Now, although I wasn't even born at the time of the Berlin Airlift, I remember as a youngster hearing about how close we came to another world war over Berlin. Photographer Todd Shutter and I were honored to make the trip to Germany with 400 airlifters and their families, and we soon became a part of the story. We were possibly the last camera crew to be detained and interrogated by the communist East Germans. We'll tell you that story a little bit later on. However, history has changed so much that the city of Berlin is not the same as it was 3 months ago, and tomorrow we'll see even more changes. So to make this program complete, we've enlisted the aid of 7 of you who made the trip to Berlin, and we will meet them in just a moment. But first, what was the airlift? You airlifters know, but for the families and especially for your children, it's important that we take this look back at the mission which saved millions of lives and maintained the world peace. June 1948, Berlin, an island of freedom surrounded by communist East Germany. What used to be the proud capital lay mostly in ruins. East Berlin is occupied by the Russians, West Berlin by the British, French, and Americans. The free world had access to the city by roads, rails, canals, and by 3 air corridors. June 24, 1948. The Russians order all roads, rails, and canals into West Berlin closed. The reason, they said, technical difficulties. But the truth was obvious. The communists had decided to take the city from the Allies. Their weapon was hunger. The Cold War was becoming warm, and the Russians dreamt of quick and easy victory. They were certain the West would not fight for the destroyed capital, which lay hundreds of miles inside the Iron Curtain. The result of the blockade was seen immediately. Fuel was cut off, the lights went out, and the 2.5 million people of West Berlin faced starvation. The city was paralyzed. The Allies had what appeared to be an impossible task: how to keep West Berlin free and its people from dying of hunger. Fortunately, a post-war treaty guaranteed the Allies access to Berlin through 3 air corridors. However, no one on either side believed it would be possible. There were 2 alternatives: give up Berlin or go to war. The decision was made to hold Berlin by supplying all of its needs by air. The Americans called it Operation Vittles, the British Operation Plainfare. The world watched as the Berlin Airlift was born.
Berlin, being a divided city, as it was a symbol that the Russians could use to test our resolve in supporting our allies, and it just happened to be a convenient opportunity for them to try to turn the screw a little bit, if you will, on the allies, or on the Western powers, and they chose to do this, and in the process have sort of an acid test to see if we would stand up to, and he also thought it would fail, I think. It was probably a good one from a percentage point of view, that we couldn't handle something like this and would have to give up our rights to the city, and we were determined not to do that.
Every day, the city had a minimum requirement of 4,500 tons of food and fuel. A call went out around the world for cargo aircraft. It would take hundreds of planes and tens of thousands of men to accomplish the greatest peacetime air transport operation in history. The first day, 32 flights carried 80 tons aboard C-47 Goonie Birds into Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. It was only a drop in the bucket. So American C-54 Skymasters were transferred from bases in Alaska, the Caribbean, and the United States. The British brought in their Yorks and their Dakotas. The French, who had no planes, contributed men, fuel, and food. It was still not enough, and the cold winter of 1948 lay ahead. General William Tunner was given the assignment, make the airlift a success.
Our biggest problem was getting enough maintenance men, to do the job, because everyone was on 12 hours a day, and that was 7 days a week. This included not only the crews, but more the men, and many men were on much longer than 12 hours a day.
The United States Army, Navy, and Air Force joined the British and French in delivering milk, butter, flour, and coal packed in surplus duffel bags. Everything was loaded and unloaded by hand. Within months, there were over 300 planes at work 24 hours a day. The air corridors were stacked and packed. Soon, the average delivery reached 7,500 tons a day. For the first time, non-lethal air power was becoming a success in solving a Cold War problem. 3 crews were assigned to each plane. They flew through the winter of '48. In April of '49, a spectacular Easter parade of 1,398 flights produced an all-time one-day record of 13,000 tons. The massive operation tested every aspect of airlift capabilities: precision flying, logistics, communications, and maintenance. Weather prediction became critical. As the operation began to succeed, the Russians took steps to make it fail. Some pilots found barrage balloons in their path and floodlights in their eyes. Others reported weapons fire near their planes. During the course of the airlift, there were more than 700 reports of Soviet harassment. But the steady stream of aircraft continued into Berlin. 50 planes flew at 5 different levels around the clock, each making 3 round trips per day. At peak operation, there was a landing and a takeoff every 3 minutes at Tempelhof. Air traffic control never faced such a task.
Baker George 2, this is the final controller. Remain on receive for the remainder of this transmission. Maintain your present elevation and continue vector 315. You're almost at the glide path. Begin your rate of descent at 500 feet per minute. We're starting down the glide path. Rate of descent is good. Azimuth is good. Elevation good. Very nice flying indeed. Maintain your heading. On course, on the glide path. Very good. Now over the end of the runway. Azimuth and elevation both perfect. Touchdown in 4 seconds. Take it over, Baker George 2. It's all yours from here.
During the airlift, the art of air traffic control was perfected, proving that anything within reason could be airlifted from anywhere in the world. The Russians, who smelt an easy victory in '48, threw up their hands in '49 and lifted the blockade. The controversial city would remain in the ranks of the free. On September the 30th, 1949, the 277,000th flight became the last. 2.3 million tons of supplies had kept West Berlin alive. 60,000 people participated in the effort. 79 of them gave their lives. Before the airlift, the children of Berlin cringed at the sound of aircraft engines. Now they waved and they cheered. They ate and they lived. The airlifters proved the human will to sustain freedom. When the blockade was lifted, no one was happier than the airlifters themselves. And no one can tell the story better than those who lived it in 1948 and 49 and who returned in 1989. So we've assembled a mini reunion of airlift veterans, and they will help me to bring alive that last fabulous week of September.
The first day they told us we were heroes. And I think by the end of the week we really thought we were. So.
And rightly so. The Germans provided a hero's welcome to those who performed the greatest humanitarian effort in history. The historic Paulskirche in Frankfurt provided the perfect setting for the first meeting between the airlifters and their German hosts.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the city of Frankfurt, I would like to extend my warmest greetings to all of you, which have come from abroad around the world to share the celebrating of the anniversary of the Berlin Airlift.
I think the entire experience for this Berlin Airlift reunion was probably some of the most honest, heartfelt feelings that I've ever experienced in my life. There was no doubt at any time that whatever they said or did, that they did not believe it. There was no fake.
It is indeed fitting that 40 years after the end of the Berlin Airlift, we meet in this hall and honor those who risked their lives in the defense of freedom. The Berlin Airlift is truly one of the important events of the post-World War II period. It involved the wartime allies of France, Great Britain, and the United States, plus the efforts of thousands of German citizens at air bases and ports in West Germany and Berlin.
I think we all were impressed that the government officials would do as much as they did. It's one thing to be told they're going to be a part of it. I think it's another thing to experience having that kind of warmth and acceptance and gratitude. And I think everyone probably felt the same as we did. Everywhere we went, we felt accepted and thanked. I felt like royalty sometimes.
For most, it was their first time on German soil since the end of the airlift. Others had returned often, having fallen in love with a land many thought could not be saved from communism.
The only person that really thought it could be done, I think, was General Tunner. And that man knew it could be done. I mean, everybody else questioned it. The pilots thought, well, no, maybe it can or not. But Tunner says, it can be done, and it's going to be done, and I'm going to do it. And he did it.
The airlifters began their second day in homage to the 79 who gave their lives in the effort. They poured into the chapel at Rhein-Main Air Base, where most of the flights began. The sun streamed through the airlift memorial window, where birds symbolized the planes carrying food to the hungry. The inscription, "Our lives for brothers in distress." The next stop, the flight line. The Goonie birds were gone, replaced by the mammoth C-5 Galaxy, with a cargo bay that could have accomplished the airlift with 1/10 of the flights necessary in the 40s. Standing in its shadow somehow brought history into focus.
I thought it was ironic that 4 years before I was bombing this area. I was in B-17s during the war, and then I turn around and I'm feeding these people. And I happened to be unlucky to be the first one to bail out an airlift in eastern Germany. And through the efforts of some of the Eastern Germans, they got me back through the Iron Curtain.
A visit to the Berlin Airlift Memorial was certainly the highlight of the day. The unique design symbolizes the 3 air bridges from West Germany to Berlin. The Germans affectionately termed the monument the Empty Fort. At the base, the names of those who gave the ultimate sacrifice.
I believe I was impressed with the fact that the Germans are more aware of the airlift than what the Americans are. People over here really don't know that there ever was a Berlin airlift. I felt a little saddened at that, I think, when I got over there. I don't know how much attention there was paid to it. And here, the airlifters are a forgotten group.
Our principal of the school, he took all the children who were B+ average out to the farmers, and we had to sack colts and potatoes. And then we went home, we asked our parents why we had to do that. And our parents explained it to us. And so on Saturdays and Sundays, we would go out to the flight line in Zellewitz-Bochum. We would watch which airplane would have our sack of coals and potatoes on there. So that is my first experience with a Berlin airlift.
As an airlifter myself, and one who first flew the corridors in the early 1960s, some 14 or 15 years after the Berlin airlift, I salute those who are here and those who are not here for whatever reason, those who produced victory when defeat was more likely.
They had the wreath-laying ceremony done by the oldest and the youngest reunion members represented, and the oldest was 92 and the youngest was 58, which showed the difference in generations that cooperated on the Berlin airlift.
To go back this time and be with them, and additionally to meet all of the men that were involved, was very thrilling to me because it meant so much to me. And to see how they cooperated together, but in doing what they had to do and the success that they had with the airlift, to see the German people respond so enthusiastically and remember them with such emotion, that was very thrilling.
One of the reunioners showed up in his best suit, his original mechanic's airlift garb.
When we had aircraft that were in trouble in Berlin, we used to have volunteer crews. We didn't force the regular crews that weren't as familiar with the aircraft to bring the aircraft back from Berlin if they'd lost an engine or if they had complete total hydraulic system failure. And we'd have volunteer crews, and of course I was single, 19, stupid, and just enjoyed, everything about it. So we'd go up there and heck, we'd take like German 2x4s and our web belts off our fatigues and everything else and wrap it around the landing gear so it wouldn't collapse and bring the airplane back if it was a hydraulic problem. And the other thing that was a little bit dicey was when you were landing, you didn't want to roll off the runway. So there was it was just ordinary people living in extraordinary times, that's all. There's nothing fantastic about it.
The air crews were flying their butts off. They were tired. You could tell when they come home on the midnight block. You could just hear their voice. And one time, a nice sunny day, they come over the Brunswick Beacon heading toward Celle. And the first one in reported in, and somebody started singing, "Show me the way to go home." And that whole block that came back joined in that song. And the pilots provided their own separation, and they landed as we watched. There was no air traffic control transmissions needed. They came home.
You could see the second runway light you had to go. And I want to give credit to the GCA operators that brought us in for landing, because they were really exceptionally good. And of course, it was the same thing day after day after day. And they were really excellent.
Evening brought out the cheer. The reunions were emotional. Most of these men were in their 20s when they flew the airlift. Back together, they seemed young again. The Germans hosted a special Hessian evening. The toast continued well into the night.
Air bridge of freedom, created in adversity, exalted in success, in mankind's finest hour. June 26, 1948, September 30th, 1949. General Milton.
On day 3, the tour motored to Wiesbaden, an historic city once occupied by the Romans. The main destination was Lindsey Air Station. The USO was on hand, as usual, to greet the guests who came for an emotional ceremony to honor the 79 who lost their lives in the airlift. 31 of them were Americans.
During that ceremony, there was about 10 drops of rain fell out of the sky. It looked like it was going to rain completely on us. And some wonderful lady said, that's just God's way of saying he approves.
In honor of the military and civilian personnel who gave their lives in the Berlin airlift, the streets of Lindsay Air Station are rededicated in the memory of the following: Captain William R. Howard, Captain Billy E. Phelps, Captain William A. Rathgaber, Captain James A. Vaughn.
Captain Vaughn's sister Bess traveled to Germany with her daughter. Their mission, to meet the men who flew with her brother, the first airlift casualty.
I had always, through the years, wanted to come see the memorials to the airlift participants. I had wanted to come to Lindsay Air Base and see the street that was named after him. And when I heard about this reunion, it was such a perfect time to come.
People my age know absolutely nothing about this. So it really means a lot to me, and it means a lot to these people to see someone my age, out enjoying this and benefiting from it. So it just really means a lot to me to be able to be here.
I was really impressed there with the current military young people.
Yes.
I couldn't help but just watch them and realize that they could not comprehend what the men who were present comprehended, and yet and realize that they have opportunities that were not available to any of us of our age group at that time.
The return trip to Frankfurt was a nostalgic dinner cruise up the unforgettable Main River.
A buddy of mine invited me over. He said, I have my girlfriend wants you to come over because we have a blind date for you. I said, okay, I'll come. I have nothing else to do.
And so that was the 20th of November 1948, and that's how we met.
The gentle river swells could not help but rock the memory back to the reason why these men originally came to Germany.
To be able to see the people in Berlin, to live, be able to be free like I am today, it was a good feeling then, and it's a good feeling now.
We learned so much from it. I think we learned in the Air Force, we learned a lot, like maintenance, people, loaders, every part. But I think what we learned is that we can support anybody, anywhere.
As the reunioners made their way back to Frankfurt that night, their thoughts were on the morning. Thursday, day 4, would be a travel day from Frankfurt across East Germany into Berlin, where the most famous landmark is the Wall. Built in 1961, the ominous barricade completely surrounded the city for 28 years, until the fall of 1989. It was constructed to keep the East Germans from fleeing to freedom. Those wishing to add their demands for its removal found it difficult to find a spot to write on.
Well, I think it proved that we were right. The Russians had to do something to back up their theory of government, and the wall proved them wrong.
And I think the wall is, symbolically as it is, you can see pictures of it on TV, you can read about it, but until you actually stand there and look at it, at the feeling, you cannot get the feeling through the TV or the photographs, in particular like up at Bernauer Strasse, where the street was divided, where one half is East Berlin and the other half is West Berlin. And that's a place where when they first put up the wall, the people were jumping out into life nets. But you've got to see it. I mean, you had to be there to experience it.
Day 5, the airlifters experienced life on the other side of the wall. Everyone was given a list of things they were forbidden to photograph: official buildings, policemen, checkpoints, and convoys. Although we were all told we could lose our cameras, no one seemed to comply.
It's like looking at color TV and then going to black and white. East Germany was gray and cold, period. That's all there was. Our tour bus was the only color that there was that I saw in East Berlin. And when we went to that big, beautiful hotel for lunch and walked in, it was like going back to Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. There was nobody in there. There was not one newspaper, not one book, nothing. One lone girl stood in a coat rack, and I think there was one coat in there. But she stood like a statue. Everything was gray and cold.
It was an eerie feeling.
Yeah.
And especially when our tour guide started feeding us that line of propaganda about how great it was to live there, and you could look on either side of the bus and know that he was lying through his teeth. He might have thought he was right, but I don't think anybody else did.
Everyone felt a deep sense of history, present and past, as our stream of buses circled this 800-year-old city. Many of the historic buildings were churches, deactivated by believers in atheism. Our communist guide proudly pointed out dozens of examples.
This church is no longer an active church today. After it was rebuilt and reopened 2 years ago, there was opened there an exhibition dedicated to the life and work of Schinkel.
Throughout the tour, she took every opportunity to heap propaganda on some very skeptical ears.
In the People's Chamber, our parliament of the country, where we have people or representatives from all the 5 political parties and organizations. It's Women's League and Cultural League, the Farmers Organization, and also, for instance, the Free German Youth.
I thought it was very interesting that we kept going around and around and around the same blocks over and over again, only in a different direction, because you kept seeing the same buildings over and over again. So it was not as though we had a grand tour of East Berlin. We didn't. We had a grand tour of their best.
After 3.5 long hours, the tour finally returned to Checkpoint Charlie, guarded ominously by alert soldiers and their machine guns. The key to open the gate, an American passport.
Our bus was the infamous lost passport.
Oh. Yes.
And we were detained at Checkpoint Charlie quite a bit longer than the rest of them. And my understanding later was not so much the person who didn't have the passport going through, but the fact that there was a live, hot passport out there that somebody could get. And as we sat on this bus, a military person come on with 1 pip on the shoulder, nothing happened, and 2 pips, and then a 3-pipper come on, and about the time we got to 4 pips, then the bus was allowed to go. It was not an easy thing to get back through there.
We also had problems getting back through Checkpoint Charlie. This is Todd Shutter, the photographer that bravely took all those pictures you just saw of Checkpoint Charlie.
Well, when the officer came on our bus, he was a 3-pipper. He walked right back to the very back of the bus where we were sitting, and he took our passports, and then he looked at the camera sitting next to me, and he looked at me, and he pointed to the camera. He said, "Is yours?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You come with me."
So Todd followed the officer out of the bus, but I interrupted them because in our business, you never separate, especially if you're in trouble, especially if you're in a communist country. So I said, "What's the problem?" And he said, "Are you with him?" And he pointed to Todd, and he pointed to the camera. And I said, "Yeah." So he said, "You come with me too." So I followed him out.
And he took us off the bus, and we had our little gray camera bag because he wanted us to bring that. And we walked off the bus and through this metal door to this little interrogation room. It was a small room, real gray, no pictures. There was a mirror on the wall, a table with a mirror on it, and a couple of chairs.
Then he pointed to our pockets, and he said, "Pockets, dump pockets." So we dumped everything out of our pockets. He went through everything that we had, went through every card in our wallet, went through everything in the gray camera bag. But the big thing that caught his attention first were the Berlin Airlift reunion buttons, and we each had several dozen of them in our pocket. Everybody in the reunion had them. We were giving them out to everybody in Berlin. He's looking at them, he's reading, he's reading, looking at them again, looking at us. And I explained to him that we were with the Berlin Airlift reunion. And he said, "I know who they are.
Well, you know what else caught his eye was our videotapes that were in the camera bag. He wanted all the videotapes, so he asked me, is this all? And I said, no, there's more. It's in the camera. He said, go bring here. So he sent me back onto the bus, but he didn't send an escort with me. So when I got on the bus and got to the camera, that's when I made the big switch.
Now, I didn't know that he made the switch. What Todd did was he took the tape that we had just shot at Checkpoint Charlie out of the camera, gave it to one of the guys on the bus, and came back down with the camera and the gear.
So he looked at the tapes, he stacked up all the tapes, took our passports and said, come at me. So we said, okay, and we walked out through that door, through a couple other metal doors and rooms similar to the ones we were in, to what seemed like the end of the world. It was the other end of the checkpoint.
That's right. He had us sit down and wait there for what seemed like
forever.
Really, I think it was about 30 minutes, but we waited, and we're sure that he did two things there, because he was only a 3-pipper. We're sure that he probably talked to a 5 or 6-pipper. And also, in each one of these rooms were these large x-ray machines that officers kept coming in and putting articles into these x-ray machines and x-raying them. So we're sure that he stuck our tapes in and x-rayed them, because when they came back, they were blank, and an x-ray machine will clean off a videotape. And when he came back, he was kind of smug.
Smiling and smug and happy looking, and he had our tapes in his hand with our passports, and he looked at us, he said, come at me. So we went back through all the little metal doors, through all the little rooms, and just before we got through the last room, he stopped and he turned to us and he handed us our passports and the tapes, and he said, you need license to be here with camera. This time I let you go, but next time I give you big trouble.
We didn't have a license because we had done some research and found out that it's almost impossible to get a license to take a camera in. So we never did apply for one, and hundreds of people on the tour also had their video cassettes, so we didn't think there'd be any problem. So anyway, we head on back to the bus, and just before we get on the bus, I take my Berlin Airlift button and I say, for you, and I handed him the button. And he looked at me and he said, 9 on the bus. So when we made it back to West Berlin, we decided to take turns touching the forbidden wall.
Now this is something, I'd made up my mind I was going to do this when I got there, one way or another. I'd always wanted to do it ever since I can remember hearing about it. I mean, this wall is just so immense. It's made out of concrete, but has a cold feeling to it. Like, it feels like oppression. And it, you know, it really made me appreciate my freedom more.
Where you at, Todd?
I'm in Berlin. That's the wall.
So then I gave the camera back to Todd and decided to take my turn touching the wall. No man's land. That's what they call the area between the fence and the wall. And I've been looking forward to doing this the whole trip, touching that wall. Freedom! 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 And that's how I felt, folks. Freedom just kind of coursing through my body. Woo! Yeah! A solid barrier at the time of our visit, the ugly wall is still an attraction. But some of the tourists paid more attention to those who flew here before it was built.
We went over there towards it. It was 150 miles over a Russian sector before we got here. So you might tell what people, so they might understand. And we were there, and then we come back now. This is the 40th anniversary. We've come back to celebrate the ending of the blockade.
Mm-hmm.
So
when did they end the blockade?
It was in, it actually stopped in May, but in September, we stopped flying then. And we had almost 100 men killed doing this.
Oh, my God.
That's the names. This here in Frankfurt, and they put their names on the memorial to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so we came up here. We're going to finish the reunion here tomorrow with dinner at Tempelhof. So we were there.
Well, gosh, I'm glad we ran into you.
The president of the Berlin House of Representatives officially welcomed us to Berlin.
Ich war damals 12 Jahre und habe in der sowjetisch besetzten Zone vor den Toren Berlins gelebt, 150 Kilometer westwärts von hier. Und ich erinnere mich als jüngerer Bub sehr wohl, wie die Flugzeuge ununterbrochen nach Berlin flogen. Und ich weiß, dass ohne dies West-Berlin heute sicher nicht in der Situation, in dieser freien Situation wäre, in der es eben ist.
I was a boy of 10 then, at the time, and I lived in the Soviet-occupied zone about 150 kilometers west of Berlin. And I remember very well the endless stream of aircraft going to West Berlin. And I know very well that without that stream, West Berlin would not be the free part of Berlin that it is today.
The reception took place at the famous Schöneberg Town Hall, the site of Berlin's Liberty Bell, and of a very memorable speech.
Our President John F. Kennedy, when he was here, I believe might have misspoke a little bit grammatically, but he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I think I speak for my comrades, their wives, the volunteers, and everybody in this group who have received the warm hospitality. And I would try to say it in Deutsch, wir sind alle Berliner. Everyone here today is I don't have my glasses to read this.
But look, I have glasses.
Okay.
Perhaps you can hear.
Is
that
better? Sir, good.
That's
it says, as inscribed, the Berlin Airlift, 40th anniversary reunion, 1949 to 1989.
Following the reception, we met Frida Staub. Now 86 years old, she claims her life was spared by the generous Allies.
Oh, die bringen everything. Potatoes, dry potatoes, egg powder, milk powder, lard, everything what we need. We got everything. And I want to thank, after 40 years, all the pilots, they did this on the American, that they bring us the food. I never forget. And I told my children that they never forget this. Thank you.
Evening brought a very special surprise. Each of the visitors were invited into the homes of the Berliners who had been waiting for this night for years. Vintage wines were poured and toasted. The celebration of thanks was shared in this home by 3 generations until the early morning hours.
Frequency.
Cheers to all of you. Welcome to the city.
Thank you so very much.
Welcome to everything you have done.
This was a superb idea that you had.
Oh, yeah. We did it once. No, we did it twice.
Cheers, sir. Prost.
Come, Dan Shelley.
Our hosts they couldn't do enough. And they looked forward to this all year, had been planning for it. They literally had their finest and their best, everything. From the moment we came in the door, they showered us with gifts and presents. They were wonderful hosts.
It wasn't quite as elaborate. It was a young couple, which neither one of them was even born during the airlift. But their parents had told them, about the airlift. And the girl's mother made sure that she knew about it, And they treated us very well, like royalty.
Throughout that evening, she wouldn't let me get about 3 feet from her. She hung on every word that I said, even though she could not understand me and I couldn't understand her. I've never heard German spoken so fast as what she could speak it. But, and since then, what's interesting is we've received quite a detailed letter from that woman, and she has more or less confessed to some of her feelings toward Americans as she was brought up in that age of what we had over here, Americans go home and so on and so forth. But she says she's really done a turnabout, and she wanted her boys to be part of that airlift.
As it did all week long, the sun shone brightly on Saturday, day 6, the last day of our visit. We began as the airlifters made an emotional return to Tempelhof Airport, once the crown jewel of Adolf Hitler. The view of the landing approach, which had been burned on their memory, was still the same. The apartment buildings, the old cemetery, the narrow approach.
On one February morning, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I made an approach down here between the apartment buildings and landed here on this runway with ceiling 0 and visibility 0, known as a 0-0 landing. And I landed my airplane and stopped at about 1,500 feet down the runway here, and that was the last airplane that arrived in Berlin that night until the fog cleared the next morning.
The operations officer would drive up in his Jeep, hand the pilot the clearance to take off. Red Cross would come up with their canteen and give you a cup of coffee and a donut. And then in the meantime, the Germans had unloaded the airplane, and off you went. One night, we were out of there in 10 minutes.
As in the 40s, kids clung to the other side of the fence, now expressing wonder, no longer hunger.
We came over here as a complete unit. In other words, the Navy was complete squadron. They had their own supplies, their own parts, their own doctors, their own mess people, completely contained. And that's how we operated over here.
I think during the airlift, they probably had the greatest pilots that this country has ever known. They always had bad weather. I don't think they ever saw the sun. And just what few flights I was on over there, when you broke out of the the fog, the plane was on the end of the runway. That's and now, this day and age, these planes can't land because there's a little fog. We circle for 5 or 6 hours. So I think there must have been the greatest group of pilots that this country's ever seen.
The airlift workhorse, the C-54 Skymaster, stood ready to greet those who once pushed its capabilities to the limit. Although its lifetime mission is complete, this model still flies, and some of the old aviators appear to remember how to take it up and bring it down.
The elevator trim, rudder trim, your nose wheel steering is over there, and all your radios, 2 stage blowers for higher altitude operation, mixture controls, cowl flaps, flap handle, gear handle.
I think that C-54 is one of the greatest. There's nothing better than a 4-engine propeller aircraft loaded to the gills going to Berlin and biting the air, fighting to get that airspeed and get airborne. It's one of the greatest aircraft that was ever made. It's just, anytime I see a C-54, I got in later during the airlift. The C-47s had already been phased out. They're still flying today, a lot of them too. But that C-54, biting that air.
Well, at the time you're doing it, you really don't feel the importance of it, the deep importance of it. You know it's an important mission, but you really don't know how important it is until after you read about it later years. And now when you come back, you feel even more important that you participated in this operation.
The orphaned and handicapped children of Berlin were invited to join the Americans for a reenactment of the famous Candy bombing. Just as it did in the 40s, the cargo bay opened, dumping out precious goodies to float to Earth on tiny chutes.
There's very few people that don't look to the kids. I mean, the next generation coming up. And I think that really the symbolism there, to see young Berlin reacting to the veterans and reenacting the Candy bomber, the Raisin bomber, the Chocolate the Flieger. I think that tells a story today that we definitely done a job, and that's why they're there and they're able to do that.
First Lieutenant Gail Halverson was the first Candy bomber. The practice was reported worldwide and helped to raise the esteem for America's sense of humanity.
He's got a flight suit on. This is one of the youngest, next to the youngest grandsons, and he's going to be a pilot. He's going to fly. Hey, 30 kids came up against the bar and said, "Hey, you know, how many sacks of flour you got in there? How many biscuits are you going to make?" You know, they were wondering what's going on. But those kids right away got onto a lecture of freedom to me about what freedom's all about. They said, "Hey, just keep trying. We're going to last. We're going to get food sometime. But if those Russians get in here, we're never going to be free. So just keep flying and we'll hang out. We can live on almost nothing." I turned around to leave, and all of a sudden it hit me those kids are different. And I said, "Why is they so different besides being so mature?" And then I realized I'd flown South America and Africa and Great Britain in the war, walked down the street in uniform, and the kids would chase you, grab your arm, shake you down for gum and candy. These kids hadn't any for 2 years. They didn't have enough to eat. And not one of those 30 kids said, "You know, you got some gum or candy?" They wouldn't be beggars.
I don't think we understand that what went through the men, and I know Halverson was not the only one involved in this, there were others even before him, I think. But to come to the realization that the children didn't know they could ask for candy and gum. To have a child that age that does not know they can ask for it, that's what breaks your heart. I wanted to just weep and weep and weep to know, I have a couple little grandsons, and they do not know a world without candy and gum.
On this day, there was more than enough candy to go around, but that was not so 40 years ago. However, the resourceful West Germans were not about to let the children down.
The Americans called the airlift the candy airlift with a candy bomber, but the Germans say raisin bombers. The fact is we run out of candies, and I went to the kitchen in McNair Barracks and got a sack full of raisins, and we put it in little packages, and the pilots had dropped them. So one kid in Berlin got us on a hit. He said, "This is no candy, this is raisins." So they called them raisin bombers. That's how it happened. The Germans don't say candy bomber, they say raisin bomber.
Ich bin Berliner!
Although it began as a simple gesture, the delivery of candy and raisins from aloft became a symbol to the world that the Western powers were determined to maintain freedom. Air power, known best for the delivery of missiles and bombs, was now viewed as a vehicle for food and heat, for candy and raisins, for freedom and for life. On this, their last afternoon in Deutschland, the reunioners made the journey to the Berlin Airlift Memorial. It is identical to the one erected at Rhein-Main in Frankfurt. Theoretically, if the structure of the two memorials continued skyward, they would meet above central Germany. Airlifters and Berliners who survived the years came closely together to again remember those who did not.
When the steady hum of aircraft engines in the skies over Berlin suddenly became a whisper which told of your mission accomplished and of a great victory for the cause of liberty. I am here today to tell you that the government and the people of the United States will always be proud of all of you, of the Americans, of course, but also of those of you who, under the flags of our allies, Great Britain and France, helped ensure that 2 million Berliners could take their destinies into their own hands as free men and women.
We pray for the day when war shall cease and the energies, treasures, and peoples of all nations will be employed to enrich the lives of all your children on the face of the earth. Grant us the determination to do our part to bring this to pass. We pledge ourselves to this task in the memory of those we have honored, for as they have given for us, may we give ourselves for others. And now may we all go in peace. Amen.
The airlift began in peacetime, determined to keep the peace, and it did. Berliners proudly fly the flag of freedom in appreciation to those who made it possible.
We feel that we're not alone in this Cold War, which the Russians start with us. So we stay together with all the Allied troops which was here, especially Americans. When we stay together and have for the future the Americans as friends, I don't have any afraid for the future.
On the long trip to Germany, there was plenty of time to read the news, and the news was mostly about Germany and the other Eastern Bloc countries. tens of thousands of people fleeing from the east to the west to freedom. Then 5 short weeks later, they're dancing on top of the Berlin Wall. Now, what did that make you folks feel like to be so involved in history for the second time?
I think that the Berlin airlifters did have a small part. And there's one thing that I felt when I was in East Berlin, it was almost like the lull before the storm. You almost knew that something was going to happen. It's, and I wish now that I had been there for it. It has to be one of the greatest events of our time.
When we were there, the people were just beginning to leave the southern part. We did not experience what's happening now in Berlin. But to know that we were checked and controlled so much and almost overnight for the tide to be turned, I wonder, can the tide be turned so quickly back? Can the wall go back up as quickly as it seems to have come down? I think we need to really stop and think and not be hoodwinked, not be gullible, and believe everything we see and hear. We need to be very cautious, I think. I'm excited for those people, though.
I went to Europe in 1946, and I served 8 years over there in the United States Air Force. 2 of those years I served in Prague, Czechoslovakia with the United States Embassy. So I have a lot of experience with the living conditions under the communists. And it's very gratifying to see the wall come down and the end of the Cold War. I have a lot of emotional reaction to what is happening in Europe. My wife and I are very glad that things have turned out the way they are. And we have to give our government and administration a lot of credit for the end of the Cold War.
Seeing and hearing about all this amazing stuff happening, we wonder if we caused part of it, you know, being in East Berlin and all the ceremonies in Germany. Of course, we know we didn't, but we like to think we did. But it scares me. We wonder what's really going to happen. The walls coming down, the fences coming down. And, it's not normal. It's not the normal thing that we're used to. And I think it's caught the United States off guard.
I feel that if the new leadership, whoever that may be in all of these countries, and particularly in Germany, can emulate the reasonableness that we saw in all of these heart-rending demonstrations in Czechoslovakia, in these huge big squares where there were these hundreds of thousands of people quietly celebrating and proclaiming freedom. I think if those leaders can be that way in their negotiations in the future, in their plans for the future of these countries, then there's great hope for the world.
One has to think that we had a part in it, how minuscule, because the publicity, the people, where this group here that went with us to film it, the local television, on the cruise on the lake there, they had local radio stations, they had the doing interviews. Everybody in West Berlin was aware at the time, and in East Berlin also, because they pick up the television and the radio. And I have to think that it might have been that little seed planted there of the veterans who in 1948 and 49 fed this city, this 2.5 million West Berliners, kept it alive for democracy. And we stand there and we see the Tempelhof Memorial, a memorial to freedom and those who gave their lives. And we look over a short distance and see that Berlin Wall. There's no comparison. Our side is better.
I remember handing out our Berlin Airlift buttons to a group of Russian soldiers that we met, and after a few had them, they all wanted them, and they came crowding around us to get those buttons. They seemed to know what it meant, too. They knew what they were for. And other people in East Berlin that received the buttons and with whom we associated, it might have made a difference to them in some small way. They might have pieced together with what they were hearing on their news with meeting these people. and maybe it helped a little bit.
The thing was ready to happen. It happened in East Germany, in '53. It blew up. They were trying to get freedom then. But that airlift and their desire for freedom, every one of us has got deep inside the one thing that counts more than leaving the home, more than leaving everything and trying for it. And that's your free agency, that right to choose a human being. And you can't cover that up with anything. You can't force it. You give their lives. Just take the shirt on their back to escape. And you're seeing that right now. Now the oppression, the wall, the mines, the barbed wire fences, and the dogs kept that into the point that the number were escaping. But that's going bananas everywhere now. And people know through communications that we have today that it's possible.
Freedom-loving people of all nations are rejoicing as the Iron Curtain is being dismantled. And the airlifters are justified in claiming their contribution to a future world free of tyranny and oppression. Assembling this diverse group of former military personnel for the 40th anniversary was an immense task accomplished over several years.
Over the years, all the ceremonies that have been done about the Berlin airlift have been for the high-level VIP DV. So we were looking for something to get the actual participants, the average guy down there, to come back, because no other time had that been done before. We thought we could match our Luftbrücke chapter up with a Berlin Airlift Association somewhere, but there was none. We couldn't find any association. So then we had to decide whether we try and take it on our own. And when we went out with a bunch of inquiries, we got an overwhelming response. And in looking at that, we realized we couldn't do all the details as far as hotels and travel from the States and all that, so we went with this particular tour group that was oriented towards military reunions.
Due to the nature of the airlift, records were poor. Locating those who might attend was an awesome job, which was tackled from both sides of the Atlantic.
They would do their 2 or 3 missions a day, go to bed, and do the same thing over again. They never had time to get together and form a lasting relationship.
I knew one person. I was lucky, although we hadn't met for 40 years. Some of these other people, they'd all worked together all through the lift, but didn't know each other. And then they came back, and it was as if they were all friends, and they'd been friends all that time. And this last week has been magnificent. I've made friends, German friends, American friends, and their wives, and it's just been marvelous.
Many thought that coordinating such a whirlwind multi-city event would be impossible, but not Hal Ryder, a veteran experienced in bringing former military men back to the places where they served.
Proud of that we can bring back men 40 years later and they still act like young people, with that enthusiasm and exuberance that made the GI of that era so famous and so legendary in the world. And as you see them handing candy to children, it brings out the character and compassion and concern of the American people even today in this age of great hope of the walls collapsing in the Iron Curtain. Also, I think it demonstrates to the world that the spirit which has made our country respected so much around the world still endures and will continue to endure. Last night, as these people went back to visit families who were, some of whom just children at the time, who originally received candy bars, it was an extraordinary success, and I've had so many thank yous from people today that it's incredible. But I want to say one other thing about what does this mean. It means a great deal to the world and to our country to remember events in history where a military force can be used without weapons to bring peace and events in the world into fruition. It was this Berlin airlift that created NATO. It was the Berlin airlift that established once and for all that communism or any other subversive type of activity would not be tolerated by the freedom-loving people. It demonstrated that the people who were vanquished in the worst war in history and who had provoked the very thing we were fighting against were themselves entitled to that same freedom of dignity of man. And it also proves that people of all nations have the same aspirations in life of having their respect, their pride, their dignity, and cooperatively we can accomplish anything.
The week-long celebration climaxed fittingly in Victory Hall at Tempelhof. Representing the contribution of the thousands of unselfish men and women, the reunioners joined in proclaiming their unforgettable accomplishment. the class of 1948-49.